This video and podcast is brought to you by the Kulkarni Law Firm. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. I have with us the one, the only Jonathan Ogurchak. And when I have Dr. Ogurchak with us, are you doctor, by the way?
I am. I'm
Okay.
a PharmD, yeah.
I'm of that generation where I was 1 year away from not being doctor, and I've always been careful. Some people take it better than others. For example, I hate being called doctor, but
I'm the same way. I told all my students the other day I use it on my my boarding passes for the airport because I'm less likely to get bounced whenever they're moving people on a flight. But that's really about it. I try to go by Jonathan. I try to get my students to call me that too. So
exactly. So I have with us Dr. Ogurchak, and Jonathan has been on several times. He actually is a very successful entrepreneur in multiple different capacities. I'm going to let him talk a little bit about himself before we dig into it. So over to you. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself, Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks so much, Darshan. Thanks so much for having me back. I mean, it's always a pleasure to be here to talk with you. But yeah, Jonathan Ogurchak. I'm a pharmacist by training. I graduated way too long ago. I feel like as the years go by, and I still keep taking students on appy rotations, and they're still super young. It just makes me feel older and older. But graduated from pharmacy school, wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do. I focused in on was looking at going hospital systems because that's where I interned. Ended up making a pivot going into academia, made a pivot from there to go into specialty, and I've been in specialty ever since. Bringing the academia and the teaching parts of it back together. So worked for a big corporate specialty pharmacy. Was actually a co-owner of an independent specialty pharmacy. Left there about 5 years ago to start a software company. And we've been building several software platforms for pharmacies to help them improve their operations and improve their patient care. And just trying to see where those next steps might take us.
Let me ask you this question before we jump into the conversation we were planning on having, which was, you're talking about software, you're talking about where things will take us. And it reminded me of what everyone's talking about right now, which is this open chat sort of software, which is essentially a souped up chatbot. And I say souped up because that's really all I could tell from it. But have you had a chance to play with it yet?
Oh, I have. Yeah, and it's actually interesting. I sent it over to my developers. I'm like, is there any way that we could find a way to incorporate bits and pieces of this into some of the things that we're doing? Because AI is it's not going away. There's benefits to it. There's ways that it can be used in a very effective way. And really this whole chatbot focus that's come out over the last week or so, that people were just taking by storm. Oh, we're going to go and have it design art pictures and design these things. Like there's definitely some healthcare implications for it. It's just a matter of harnessing it the right way and having some of the checks and balances to know that it's going to be done correctly. You can program these things to do whatever you want them to do. It's just a matter of making sure hey, let's set it up so that it could counsel a patient whenever a pharmacist isn't available. Yeah. A lot of those things should be cut and dry as far as how you look to manage side effects or mitigate things. But if you don't have good programming in and teach the bot what it's supposed to say, you could be really screwing some things up. So I'm sure that it's going to come, and with that's going to come some additional oversight for how that might be managed across the board.
I believe this one's called OpenChat AI 3.5, and everyone's talking about this 4 version that's going to come out. But I played around with the 3.5 the last couple of days, and it seems really smart until you start asking it questions that you know the answer to, and you actually happen to be a little bit of an expert in the space. And
you're exactly right.
But I can see a reasonable person going, this seems legit. So I'm actually curious from the perspective of where this is going, and you're talking to your developer going, how do we incorporate something like this in? Do you find the implications? Like I was thinking about exactly what you were talking about, which is, could this replace a pharmacist in giving feedback to a potential patient who needs to be counseled, for example, if a pharmacist is not available? And my thought process was, well, I want to get your thought process before I give you mine. Yeah.
No, yeah, I see both sides. I see where there's a potential benefit if you can set up that the technology to actually do what you intended to do and have the intended outputs and learn from the experiences. I mean, that's what we all do as pharmacists anyways. Every time that we're presented with a new patient and they're having some new side effect, we take that, we store it away somewhere, and we're like, oh, wait a second, I remember when this patient told me that, and bring it back. This is just a more normalized way of doing those sorts of things. However, when you think of how the practice of pharmacy is regulated, and it's regulated at the state level, there's not really anything. If I were to go to the PA Board of Pharmacy, there's nothing in there that says how do you train a chatbot with the same intelligence that you as a pharmacist should have, and that same clinical disposition that you should have.
Yeah.
And how do you look to manage that? There was actually an instance, when was it? A couple years back, I was doing a talk for State Board of Pharmacy up in the Northeast, and they were talking about exactly this, like not what do you do, but like in the advent of things like predictive analytics and looking at some of these chatbot types of functionalities like Amazon bills. When you call Amazon for a refund or a replacement or something like that, chances are it's not a real person. You have it's a lot of at least the initial entry level folks that you're talking to. It's the term is escaping me, like actual technical term, but it's basically a chatbot but it has the voice technology that it sounds like you're speaking to somebody.
Oh, I thought they were just Indian sort of programmer. Like
there's a good number of these programs where when you're speaking to somebody, it sounds. And we actually did a demo. We were looking at building some technology into one of our platforms where you took I wish I remember the name of it. It's escaping me right now, but it's a voice over chat technology where it sounds conversational. It's a conversational AI type of offering. So when you call in, it sounds like you're talking to a person. And there's actually a technology we're looking at integrating for purposes of things like calling offices for prior authorizations. Chances are when you're calling an insurance company, a lot of these things might be a bot type of offering. And the scenario that was presented to us by the guys that developed some of this AI tech for prior authors, they said, it's like a bot talking to a bot, and it's like you don't even know. And you take that step back and you think of it from a regulatory perspective. When you do things like talking about a prior auth, that's one thing. When you do things about talking about mitigating adverse effects, that's entirely different altogether. And I think that the technology is moving so quickly as it relates to healthcare. State boards of pharmacy, as well as some of the federal health oversight boards like the FDA, like CMS, like the DEA, they're going to have to follow suit, because if they don't look to the next steps of this, the technology is going to be there. People aren't going to know how to manage it and how to leverage it appropriately. And it's going to be a missed opportunity for everybody.
So it's interesting you say that. So two things come to mind for me. So unlike our usual conversations where I just ask you questions, we'll sort of make it a little bit more interactive today. But the first thing that came to mind for me was if there is a typical situation where you've got a pharmacist in there and they're a new pharmacist, you get to train them by going, look, I want you to think about this adverse event because it pops up often enough in our patient population. And I want you to be aware of it because we'd be doing a disservice to our patients if we don't think about that. Most pharmacists are not, they may be computer savvy, but they're not going to be coding savvy. How do you train a chatbot to look out for something in your population or to look out for something that happens often enough in your case? And I think that's the problem. If we go down this path of we are going to use chatbots more, we then take on the responsibility of giving those appropriate notifications. And the question is, are we competent at that without going into what I think of when I have you used Epic before or any of the EMR systems? I'm sure.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So when I work in a hospital pharmacy, I work with Epic, and one of the big problems you deal with is overwarning. Like everything gets warned. You get beeps on everything. You're just going, this is useless because I don't know which ones actually matter anymore. So how do you take that chatbot from, I want you to analyze and bring it all together to and make it relevant to avoid overwarning, to actually being functional. So that's my first thought. My second thought is actually a Supreme Court case, which came out and specifically said that if you so the next concept you raised was this idea that state boards and FDA and CMS and DEA all need to take a more active role in telling people what to do, because otherwise it'll be a missed opportunity. And from a practical perspective, I agree with you 100%, because if they don't tell us what to do, we aren't going to sort of act on it. But the funny thing is that from a Supreme Court decision standpoint, this was from the Fox v. FCC case several years ago at this point. This is the Janet Jackson nipple that showed up in the Super Bowl situation. So we're talking, 10 years at this point? But
at least, yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, Fox was taken to, was fined by the FCC. And they said that you shouldn't have let that happen. And the court basically said, did you tell Fox or the industry in general that this is not something that they can do? And the FCC took the general position that, no, we didn't tell them, but they should have known. And the Supreme Court said, you can't just expect people to know. You've got to be very clear about what you're not allowed to do. So I think what people lose is this idea that there's an opportunity when there's no information. And the less information there is, the more opportunity there is, because no one's had a chance to tell you this is not allowed. Because that's when they can actually regulate you, because they've had a chance to tell you this is not allowed. Which brings me to the third point. So sorry, I apparently had a lot of points. Brings me to the third point, which is, we talked a little bit a second ago about this idea that we can have our pharmacists or AIs or chatbots learn from conversations and communications people are having. So let's say someone comes in, and I'm going to be nice about this, but let's say I go to CVS's website, buy diapers, and then go to order on Amazon. I go to order some kind of, say, tetracycline, for argument's sake. And if you didn't follow someone, you would go, it's just a tetracycline order. But if you are using cookies and you're tracking people, you would go, is that a mom buying buying diapers and then tetracycline? Is there a problem? So there are health implications to that. Very recently, I want to say this, in the last 7 days, OCR, which is the Office of Civil Rights, came out and updated HIPAA to talk about tracking technologies. So that's going to be important as well. And that's going to have implications on how AI starts viewing our information. So I'll let you comment on all three, but I just thought that.
Yeah, I was jotting some notes here just to keep track of it. So let's talk about that most recent one, about the whole, tracking and learning and doing across the board. Yeah. One of the things that's unique about healthcare when it comes to technology is it is so segmented from everything else. And part of it has been because of HIPAA and high tech and all these regulatory sorts of offerings. But part of it's because we just don't know. I mean, historically, healthcare is behind the times when it comes to it. And I think I've used the analogy for you before. If I realize that I need diapers, I could log on to my Amazon account, click buy, and they show up on my front porch within 24 to 48 hours.
Yep.
Because I bought those diapers, they're going to show up everywhere across my social media feeds, everywhere across my Google search. It's tracking me essentially to see what I'm doing and how they can influence decisions elsewhere. You don't see that traditionally when it comes to healthcare, because it is separate, it is segmented, it is apart from that. And it's part of that is because you don't see that technology necessarily. If I go to local community pharmacy, if I go to specialty pharmacy and I buy that product, that data is not being shared elsewhere to say, here's Jonathan, he got his blood pressure medicine, maybe we should recommend that he goes out and buys a blood pressure cuff. There's not the cross-brand influencing that you tend to see elsewhere. And I'm not as familiar with that OCR piece of things, but I need to read up on that because HIPAA is everywhere. And I'll be curious to see how that works, because you haven't seen that tracking piece moving into healthcare from a diagnostic perspective historically. It usually goes based on some of the other elements therein, like, oh, I Googled the American College of Rheumatology, so maybe I'm going to make a recommendation about a rheumatology product, those sorts of things, but it's not direct to patient historically. Going back to your first point, the epic click fatigue and all of that stuff, like that piece is just troubling. And you have that overwarning piece of things. Actually, we've encountered that, and we've tried to mitigate that with our Cadence product that we built. So we built our patient management platform. It sits on top of the dispensing system. It can manage all of the workflows, the data captures, etc. But we've done it in a faux AI type of manner, where like if we know what we need to program and we know what the data is that comes back out of it, we can look to adapt and adjust. Perfect case in point, we had an instance where we were capturing side effects, and we started to see that one drug in particular, patients were having cough, and then they were discontinuing within a month or two afterwards. And so we started to change our counseling points to say, hey, there's enough patients here. Why don't we change our counseling so that when we counsel that patient to say, hey, if you're having a cough, swish and spit, do this. Here's all of the things that you could do proactively to prevent that. And it stopped that from tracking and moving forward with some of these issues. So it's kind of like that. Hey, you have some people there, you have the ability to proactively push some of these things in and program the thoughts that you would want to have, but then also elicit the data on the back end to make sure that your thoughts are valid. The last point that you had there about, saying what's very clear what you can and can't do, that's healthcare as a whole. You think of how many times, in practice, somebody's like, well, I exerted my professional judgment. Well, how do you inlay that professional judgment initially? How do you actually know that Darshan was treated to know, hey, let me counsel that patient on a cough, let me counsel that patient to do X, Y, or Z? Sure, you have the package insert from the FDA, but package insert is usually drafted based on a very small sample size. That's not when that drug is out in the wild, and it's not a controlled sterile clinical trial type of setting. And so once you have patients that are leveraging and utilizing these drugs and they start to see these additional side effects, you as the clinician, you as the practitioner, kind of have to be on your toes. You have to know how to counsel to what you know and counsel to what is now being presented to you and make a rational judgment. I don't know if we're there just yet from the AI piece of things or even the regulatory piece of things, because regulatory struggles with that. Like, hey, what do you counsel on? What do you not? Well, I exerted my professional judgment based on the facts that were presented to me. It makes it a little bit more of a interesting dynamic to try to manage that.
I think that's such an interesting point, right? Getting into this idea of professional judgment, because professional judgment is great until it fails. So, let's say the example we gave, tetracycline, and to a baby. We know, I'm really going back. I can't remember. My clinical judgment is a little skewed, but I think it caused yellowing of bones, is my recollection.
I believe so. Yeah. See, I'm like a pharmacist on paper here. You call me doctor, exactly. But it really doesn't mean. Yeah, it means as much for the boarding pass,
Exactly.
Real pharmacist for a while.
Exactly. Anyway, so the point being, no one's really going to go, oh, you should have mentioned tetracycline would yellow my baby's bones or my baby's teeth 95% of the time, until the 5% where you really should have told the mother this. And the fact that you didn't, she's going to sue you at this point. So I guess the question is something, and this is totally, we're like well deep into this, so we're going to talk about something completely different, but the first three words you uttered took us down this path. So
we're going down that rabbit hole,
But I guess my question for you is, do you think that as we continue this conversation, these chatbots and the like are going to be good enough for 95% of the situations, 85% of the situations, and that limits the impact that pharmacists can have, not because pharmacists couldn't help, but because we're adding an incremental value at a non-incremental cost?
I think you hit the nail on the head right there. I think that what it affords the opportunity to do is allow for that. It's the traditional 80-20 rule. 80% of those cases that could be handled through a traditional conversational AI are going to be handled in that manner. If there's something that falls out and it seems like it's not correct, or it seems like it's not going to follow that pattern, you can then escalate to a pharmacist that can exert that clinical judgment. And I think that that's where you start to see the value. It's affording the opportunity for the technology to do what the technology is really good at, and identify the red flags and escalate those to the next step. Back to that prior auth technology that I had mentioned before. If I were to be opening a pharmacy tomorrow, would I want to go and hire a team of 5 individuals to make phone calls and just document information from an insurance company? Or would I rather hire one really good individual and a chatbot that is going to capture that information from the insurance company? It's going to do 80% of the work that I would be paying 4 other people to do. And in reality, if there's a problem, I can then escalate it to the one person that's a real person that can exert their judgment. To me, it seems like a no-brainer. And not just from a cost perspective of me as a business owner that would be leveraging that, but from a continuity perspective. If you're training and it's going to happen the exact same way every single time, it's allowing for these patterns to exist to help to mitigate risk, to mitigate some of those instances where you have a new hire versus a seasoned veteran, and there's some disparities there. You have some disparities in a West Coast hire versus an East Coast hire. All of those different nuance that tend to happen. If you're running your business as a business, there should be continuity in how those things are cared for. And if you can find a way to implement technology to do that and leverage the heartbeat pulse people, the real people, to actually make that judgment when they need to, I think that's where you're going to start to see each of those individuals start to practice to the top of their respective role. They're going to see the pharmacist practice to the true top of their license, because they're able to do those things that make them think and make them process and make them exert that clinical judgment. For your non-clinicians, you're making them think outside the box and hey, everything else is going to be handled for me, but if there's a problem, let me fix the problem. And that's what tends to happen in healthcare, to your point. It's not a problem until it becomes a problem. But how many of those situations are not problems that could just be handled by a very basic approach? If you're taking think of the thought process of what's occurred over the last 15, 20 years. If I have a question, I'm not feeling good, how many people in the general population pull up their iPhone and go to Safari and say, Google, tell me what this means? And you go to Dr. Google for a solution or a recommendation, and you're going down whatever that path is from the input of that user. But if you can leverage some of this technology to better focus and better help make reasonable requests and decisions and guidance, I just think that the possibilities truly are endless if we start to head down that pathway.
I love the idea of what you're talking about, because I'll tell you 2 parts of this. So the one was earlier on in the conversation, you mentioned this idea of your third-party payer, for example, in the context of a prior auth, is maybe a computer, maybe a chatbot. And you unleash your own chatbot, so it's 2 chatbots talking against each other. And that sounds hilarious until you realize that that's actually happened multiple times already.
You're exactly right.
So the funny part is, and I don't know if you caught this, because I tend to follow tech news, and it sounds like you do too. So for those people who don't follow this, they followed these conversations when they basically unleashed 2 AIs against each other. And turns out they developed their own language. And they, I forget the example, but it was something like then was an actual phrase they used, and it wasn't a mistake. But it felt like those systems understood what the words then together meant. It was some version of like an abbreviation of, we've gone through multiple cycles and this is what comes together. So they developed their own shorthand and the like. My question or my comment is, as we continue, do we then become a system that is trying to understand? Like, your pharmacists now go from being pharmacists who are experts in pharmacy to tech-enabled experts. And then you start dealing with the other 2 issues that pop up, which is, how do you ensure that this information is accurate. And I actually went in and started playing with the OpenAI, and it was, as I mentioned to you earlier, it sounded very plausible until I started poking holes at it. And it didn't survive any of the holes I poked at it. That's not to say that it's not good. Like I said, in probably about 65% of the cases, it was pretty decent. What worried me was that remaining 35% where I may not know any different. And that concerns me from a patient standpoint. Now, you as the pharmacist are, number one, having to fix what your AI told them. And you're spending a ton of energy and effort trying to do that. And so uneducate them and then re-educate them becomes a whole new problem. Do you, for example, give your own AI professional courtesy, or does that not exist for an AI?
That's a really good point. Well, I think it kind of falls back in that idea that we had talked about of kind of building this faux AI that we've done within our Cadence platform. So we have enabled as a part of it a two-way texting functionality, which a lot of dispensing systems don't. You have to bring in a plugin. We're like, all right, let's just build it right in. So we know when I'm talking to Darshan, as long as you opt into texting, we'll send you messages and reminders and alerts and things like that. But you could always respond back with a question. Mm-hmm. And so what we've done with that is we've taken some of those trigger words that would allow for escalation or would allow for a different path. Yeah, if you're asking a question about your tracking number, that's one thing. But if you respond back and say, sorry, I'm in the hospital, whoop, red flag, that's something that should be alerted and it should be trailed over. And so it's instead of that 65-35 rule, it's getting us closer to that 80-20 type of offering where, we're taking what we know and we're allowing it to function in a environment where it can help support those patients and meet them where they're at. But until we know a little bit more and until we can start to train the systems to do what they need to do, let's still find flags that we can use to actually create that intervention. And I think a perfect use case is what you had talked about. Like you're using this chat feature, the one that I was working, that OpenAI that I was working with and playing around with. I was like, I'm going to use this for all of my marketing collateral. Why not? Like, hey, build me a marketing plan for this. And it comes across and it's pretty straightforward. But then the first thing that you see, if you recall when you log in, is it says this is in beta mode. And This is stuff that it's going to continue to improve over time. And I think that that's one of the benefits there. I mean, going back to what we first started talking about, you have some of the, I'm sure we've all met them, the old curmudgeon-y pharmacists that they don't want to learn something that's new, even if it's clinically relevant.
Yeah.
You're never going to change that. But if you can take and change the technology to say, hey, we're going to teach you something a little bit new here and apply that moving forward. Again, it's allowing the systems to become a little bit smarter, and not saying that it's going to be, Terminator style, oversight of things that, and we're taking over the world with pharmacist robots, but it's allowing for the technology to meet patients where they're at and help them to benefit from it as they continue to learn and know and prove that forward.
I think two parts jump out to me that are kind of important. And I'm gonna we're gonna get closer to ending because we're well past time. But I think the point you made a few seconds ago was really important. This idea that yes, AI is coming. But no, it doesn't mean that pharmacists' jobs are going. It means pharmacists will be operating at a different level. Just because people always work with this idea that there's only a fixed amount of work, and if someone else gets the work, you don't. I have a feeling that, quite honestly, patients have not been asking the questions they want to ask because they don't want to wait in lines. They don't want to talk to someone who desperately wants to get off the phone. If we land up in a scenario where patients can ask 65% of the questions they want to ask, and those things are answered, and yes, Amazon might shut down its system for hospitals, but they didn't shut down the system for asking questions at home. And that becomes the way technology enables enables patients to ask the questions they want to ask immediately. And then when there's what do I do if I've missed a dose? Yeah, the system can probably answer that. But I'm taking these 4 drugs and I have this disease state. I want to talk to someone. That's not a question the system should be answering. That should be shuttled onto a human being, at least for now. There might be a future in which that changes.
Yeah, it's a triage mechanism. But to your point, when I was at Decreto years ago, a big corporate specialty pharmacy or whatever, we were dealing with pulmonary hypertension patients, and they wanted to run a clinical algorithm for those patients to say, we want to help stratify them. We want to see if they're doing well or if they're not on their therapies. But because it was a validated tool, and because these patients were on the phone, you would have a script. Well, on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is bad or very bad, and 2 is bad, and 3 is okay, and you had to read the full question in order for it to be validated data coming in. After about 2 months, these patients, like, they're feeling like crap. They're sitting up to be on the phone. They're having respiratory distress or whatever. They realized if they could say that they were very good, they'd get off that phone earlier because they weren't getting triaged to somebody. And so it was part of the thought process behind what we did within that Cadence offering, is to say, well, where can we meet the patients where they're at? If we know that they want to get off the phone, would it make more sense to send them the information when we know it's going to be relevant? And is there an impact of doing something like that? Like, if we're going to be sending a drug to the patient's home, they know within 72 hours of giving themselves a self-injectable drug, they're going to have these terrible side effects unless they hydrate before they do that. Let's send them a text message 24 hours ahead of time. Say, hey, make sure you grab your Gatorade, finish it today. Let's send them a text message 72 hours later. Do you feel better? Do you feel worse? You now have some value-based outcomes here to say, is there a value in us automating this? And it's all because we have 2 data points. We know that the drug is going to cause an issue, and we know when they're going to take the drug. Little things like that, I think we're going to start to see that it's allowing those pharmacists, yes, it's tech-enabled, but it's allowing them to meet the patient where they're at, where, oh, this is kind of cool. Like, you have your phone with you all the time. You have an Apple Watch on. Let's ask these questions instead of it being during that point when I don't want to talk to anybody anymore. I want to go lay back down because I don't feel good. Let me get you when you're feeling bad. Let's show the intervention and then prove the worth of the clinician by doing that.
I love it. Jonathan, we can keep going on, obviously. And we've demonstrated that we can take literally one single line and make a half-hour podcast out of it. So thank you for coming on. Thank you for having this conversation.
Thanks for having me, as always. Yeah, sure. So you could visit our website. So our Stack product for compliance is at managewithstack.com. Our Cadence product that we've alluded to a couple times here today, it's at cadence.healthcare. And you can read a little bit more about those things. And my contact information is there, or on my LinkedIn page, which is linked on both of those locations. So
awesome. Jonathan, thank you again for coming on. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me always. Appreciate it.
These conversations are not intended to be legal, regulatory, or clinical advice and may not be right for you. These conversations are intended for educational purposes only. Conversations on this forum do not create